Welcome everyone to Technology That Matters, the financial risks and rewards of therapeutics for infectious diseases by SGInnovate and Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, or SMART. This is part of our Technology That Matters series, where we have invited MIT professors to share their technologies and knowledge with our community. I'm Zing from SGInnovate, and if you are new to us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore with the mission to build deep tech innovations from Singapore for the world. We invest in and help build deep tech startups in the fields of artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and medtech, just to name a few. We work with entrepreneurial scientists and clinicians to help bring their innovative research from lab to market. And we also develop tech talent and engage with a vibrant deep tech ecosystem. Today, we are excited to hear from Prof. Andrew Loh as he shares from a financial economics perspective of why the trend away from vaccines and anti-infectives occurred, how the pandemic could change this trend, and what these changes mean for all stakeholders. Following his presentation, we will have a Fireside Chat and Q&A session moderated by Dr. Howard Califano. Just some house rules. During the webinar, if you have any questions to Prof. Loh during the event, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And do feel free to use the chat box to connect with our wider community. Now, let me hand over the time to Dr. Califano, Director of the Innovation Center at SMART, to say a few words.
Yang, thank you very much, and good morning and welcome to everyone. The Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, or SMART, is pleased to be organizing this event with SGInnovate. The Technology That Matters series, or TTM, brings thought leaders from MIT to share and get into discussions with our Singapore colleagues. This is the first in a series of events we have planned for 2021. We look forward to a discussion after each speaker presents, so please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask questions. I'm Howard Califano, and I'll be your host for this event. For those of you who may not be familiar with SMART, we're the largest research center MIT has outside of Boston, and we've been an integral part of the Singapore research community for more than 15 years. We conduct collaborative research and help researchers throughout Singapore drive their discoveries to impact in areas including healthcare, electronics, new materials, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and AI. We are very pleased today to have our guest, Prof. Andrew Loh. Prof. Loh is the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's a director of MIT's Laboratory for Financial Engineering and principal investigator at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. His healthcare-related research interests include new financial engineering tools, business models for drug and device development, and predicting clinical outcomes via machine learning techniques. He is co-founder and director of Bridge Biopharma, co-founder and chairman of QLS Advisors, and director of Roant Sciences. He has received many awards, and he's published extensively, including his recent book, Adaptive Markets, Financial Evolution at the Speed of Light. He's listed in Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He currently is in Boston and sharing his evening with us. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the screen over to Prof. Loh for his presentation.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. No echo.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I want to start by thanking Dr. Califano and the Singapore MIT Research and Technology Alliance and SGInnovate and Zing for all of their help and hospitality in inviting me to be with all of you tonight. And I want to thank all of you for joining. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy amidst this pandemic. I have to say that I'm really honored to be a part of this event here with you tonight, or today, your day, good morning. My only regret is I can't be there in person. I have never visited Singapore. I've long wanted to do so, but I've actually felt a great kinship for your country for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is because I've had many Singaporean students over the years, some of my very best students, and this year is no exception. I have two extraordinarily talented students from Singapore that I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the work that I've been doing with them, Kin Wei Xia and Chihim Wong. And I'm going to really miss them. They've just graduated, the two of them, so they're now doctors. And you know, after their departure, I have to tell you, my research productivity is going to take a big hit. I've had many other students in the past, and I'm very grateful for all of the wonderful friendship that Singapore has had with us here in the United States. And I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to visit in person. Well, what I want to talk about tonight, or today, sorry, is some work that I've been focusing on involving the biomedical landscape. And in particular, the topic of what I'm going to cover today is the financial risk and rewards of therapeutics for infectious diseases. Clearly something that's on everybody's mind, given that we are still facing COVID-19. So I want to start with an observation. And the observation is something that I'm not qualified to comment on, other than to point out that experts have told me, and I suspect that those of you who are in the biotech and pharma industries can acknowledge this. We are in a very unusual period right now in biomedicine. We're at an inflection point. And a good case in point is what's been going on with vaccine development. This is a graphic from a variety of different vaccine development programs from 1880 to 2016. And what is represented in these horizontal bars is the number of years that have passed between the time an infectious disease is discovered to the point where we've actually developed a successful vaccine against that disease. And what you can see from this graph is that up until pretty recently, the typical time frame for developing an effective vaccine is measured in years, and in some cases in decades. And for a number of infectious diseases, we don't actually have a vaccine, so we still have to deal with the effects of those terrible diseases. Well, that was as of 2016. What we know now is that the way that vaccines are developed has changed dramatically over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. This is an illustration from a New England Journal article that described the old way that vaccines were developed. This is the typical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial above here. And in gray is the typical approach to manufacturing a vaccine if and when you get it approved. What has happened with COVID-19 is the graphic below. You can see that the timeline is greatly compressed. But of course, you can't really see that. It's actually very difficult to get a sense of how quickly they are. So let me just illustrate to you in the one case of Moderna's mRNA 1273. On January the 11th, the SARS-CoV-2 sequence was shared with those of us in the United States, including with Moderna. January the 11th of this year. And last year, 2020. And by March the 16th of 2020, 63 days later, the first patient was dosed with this vaccine, which is really an extraordinary accomplishment. 63 days versus years or decades. And so this is what I mean by biomedicine is at an inflection point. Another illustration is if you in 2000 listed all of the top 30 best-selling drugs, this is the list that you would see. Out of the top 30 best-selling drugs, what's highlighted in blue in this chart are the drugs that came out of biotech or academic medicine. The other 26 were developed by big pharma. That was in the year 2000. Let's fast forward to the year 2018. In 2018, the exact same chart, the top 30 best-selling drugs, looks like this. And highlighted in blue are, again, the drugs that came out of the biotech industry or academic medicine. And you can see that the vast majority of the best-selling drugs are being developed not by big pharma anymore. They're obviously done in partnership with big pharma, but they're not done at the very origins by big pharma. It's coming out of biotech and academic medical centers. And if you look at the top 10 drugs, nine out of the top 10 came out of that biotech academic medicine. This is what I mean by the inflection point. And in fact, we even see that inflection point today. We know that the two vaccines that are available and approved in the United States are drugs that came out of Moderna, a biotech company, and Pfizer, but in collaboration with BioNTech, who actually developed the vaccine to begin with, and they are also a biotech company. Those are the two approved drugs in the United States for COVID-19. And what about some of the other big players like Merck, which has traditionally been an extraordinarily powerful force in vaccine development? Merck announced just a couple of days ago that they are terminating their phase 1 trial in their COVID-19 vaccine because it did not show efficacy. And so this is an example of how the entire landscape has really shifted. My colleagues at MIT, Phil Sharp, Susan Hockfield, and Tyler Jacks, they produced a report a few years ago to describe this inflection point, which is called convergence, the convergence of the life sciences, the physical sciences, and engineering. And one way that biomedical experts describe this convergence, this inflection point, is the omics revolution. Genomics, the science of the sequence of your DNA. Epigenomics, the study of the on-off switches that cause certain genes to be expressed and others to be suppressed. Transcriptomics, the study of how these gene sequences get translated into various kinds of proteins. Proteomics, the study of the 20 to 25,000 proteins that make up the human body. Metabolomics, the chemical reactions that occur in our bodies. And finally, and most recently, microbiomics, the study of the bacterial colonies that help us with our bodily functions. All of these omics have experienced tremendous advances over the last few years, with the exception of one. And that omics, which is causing a bottleneck in innovation for this industry, happens to be economics. The ability to pay for all of these therapies and to come up with the appropriate business models. It turns out that there hasn't been nearly as much progress in how we finance and develop these drugs as in the underlying science and medicine. Now, in the industry, they refer to this phenomenon as the so-called valley of death. There's this particular area between preclinical research and development and phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, where it is really hard to raise money. Even if you are a successful biotech entrepreneurs, VCs now prefer to wait a little bit later on. They don't take projects as early as they have in the past, maybe because there are so many more projects that are in later stages that they don't need to, maybe because there are changes in their risk preferences. But the point is that we do have this valley of death in early stage drug discovery. And from my point of view, the economic point of view, it's because of increasing risk and uncertainty. And the fact that we're making all these breakthroughs, the omics revolution, has had this unintended consequence that we're actually creating more risk and uncertainty for the investors that have put their investments in existing assets, which could be made obsolete by the next generation of drug development projects. And so risk and uncertainty is something that investors will respond to. And despite the fact that I'm outside of the biopharma industry, I can tell you what investors do in the face of risk. So let me give you an example that some of you may have seen, those of you who were in my MBA classes at MIT years ago. I use this example a lot. I'm going to show you 4 different financial investments. I'm not going to tell you what they are or even over what time period they span. I'm simply going to show you what happens if you put $1 into each of these investments and leave them there for a period of many years. And the question that I'm going to ask you in the poll that I'm about to launch is to pick one of these 4 investments. You can only have one. You can't mix and match them. But I'd like you to pick one of these 4 investments to invest your in retirement money, to invest your kids' college education fund, to invest your parents' or grandparents' life savings. Now, the green investment turns $1 into $2, not very rewarding, but very little risk. The red line turns $1 into $5, way more rewarding, but as you can see, lots more ups and downs. The blue line is the most rewarding of all. It turns $1 into about $8, but as you can tell, way, way, way more volatile. And last but not least, the black line seems to be somewhere in the middle, turning $1 into $7, but not nearly as risky. So the question that I would put to you is, which one of these would you prefer? Clearly, this is a matter of risk preferences, risk-reward trade-off, right? And so it looks like we're almost done with the poll. I'll leave it on for a couple of seconds. But it looks like what we're seeing here, and I'll show you the results in just a minute, what we're seeing here is very much what we saw in all of the classes that I've ever used this example. So what we've seen is that the vast majority of you would prefer the black line over all of these others. And there's actually a good reason for that I'll describe to you in just a minute. So let me tell you, for those of you who don't know what these assets are, let me tell you a little bit about them. First of all, the time period is from 1990 to 2008. So we're actually talking about quite a few years. Second, US Treasury bills, that's the green asset, the safest asset in the world, at least for the next few weeks. We will see what happens with budget negotiations in the United States. But the safest asset in the world is not particularly rewarding. So if you had put your money into that asset in 2008, you would have earned pretty much nothing since then. The red asset is the S&P 500. That's the US stock market. And if you had invested in that in 2008, well, congratulations, you would have done really well since then. The blue line is the single pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, one of the largest pharma companies in the world. And if you had put your money in that, well, congratulations, you would have done spectacularly well since 2008. And what about the black line, which most of you chose? Well, it turns out that that is the returns of a private investment fund called the Fairfield Century Fund, which was the feeder fund for the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. And that's why I had to stop this exercise in 2008, because that's when the Ponzi scheme blew up. Now, you realize how that Ponzi scheme got so large, given what all of you picked. It's because human nature drives us towards investing in high-yielding, low-risk assets. And in finance, we have a term to measure that, and it's called the Sharpe ratio. The Sharpe ratio is named after William Sharpe, the founder of the capital asset pricing model and Nobel Prize winner in economics. And the basic idea behind the Sharpe ratio is that it is a measure of your risk-adjusted return, the return per unit risk. The numerator is the average return of an investment above and beyond T-bills. The denominator is the risk as measured by the standard deviation of the volatility. And so when you calculate the Sharpe ratio of the S&P 500 and Pfizer, you see that they're in the same ballpark, 0.43 versus 0.54. But the Madoff Ponzi scheme, before it blew up, the Sharpe ratio on paper was an order of magnitude larger, which is what drew all of these unfortunate victims to that Ponzi scheme. Well, it turns out that biomedicine has been suffering from a declining Sharpe ratio as we make progress with all of these incredible omics. The fact that things have gotten riskier from a financial point of view means that other things equal, including the numerator of the Sharpe ratio staying the same, the denominator is getting larger. That's actually causing the Sharpe ratio to decline, particularly at the early stages. And as a result, there's less and less money to be had for those early stage preclinical drug discovery companies. They are still being funded to some degree. And overall, the biotech sector has gotten lots more money over the course of the last few years. But much of that money has been going into somewhat later stage assets. And so the question that my colleagues and I started studying a few years ago is, how do we get money back into the space? And in a paper that I published a few years ago, we proposed using a simple idea, portfolio theory, taking multiple shots on goal, but doing it within the context of a single company that combined all of these different characteristics of these assets. And most importantly, to choose the assets so that they would be relatively uncorrelated and so that they would have natural diversification. It turns out that in the area of rare diseases, diseases that, according to the United States Orphan Drug Act of 1983, affect 200,000 patients or less, diseases like ALS, hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Huntington's disease, because of these relatively smaller patient populations, and because of the underlying nature of the disease and the therapeutics, the success or failure of rare disease companies generally are uncorrelated with each other. And this is an amazing thing because it leads to massive diversification opportunities. So I wrote a paper in 2015 that simulated a portfolio with these rare disease drugs. And the fact that you have lack of correlation means that when you calculate a rate of return, you're getting a very, very high profitability. In this case, on order of about 22% IRR, which is better than most hedge funds have performed over that time period. So it turns out that using these financial concepts, new business models are emerging. And I'll give you one example, which I've been fortunate enough to be involved in. After I published the paper, one of my former students, a chemical engineering PhD student from MIT, called me up and said, Professor Lowe, I read your paper, I was really interested in it. Would you mind meeting with me so that I could discuss with you, the assumptions that you used to the simulations? And I said, of course, Neil, I'd be happy to meet with you. And he sat down and we went over the simulations. He gave me his perspectives on, the parameters that he would be using from his point of view. At the time, he was a biotech venture capitalist. So he knew a lot more than I did about the underlying parameters. We were using numbers from basic industry figures. And over the course of a number of months, we ran many, many simulations. And at the end of a 5 or 6 month process, he came into my office and said to me, I just want to let you know, I quit my job yesterday. I'm going to build this company. And I have to tell you that that was the first time a student had ever done something like that. And I was really scared. So I said, Neil, wait a minute. Are you sure you don't want to let me run a few more simulations before you quit your job? And he said, no, I'm very excited about it. My wife is fine and we're ready to do it. So I was both excited and scared. And I felt guilty enough that I invested a small amount of money in his little startup, along with some other family and friends. In retrospect, I wish I'd invested a lot more, as you'll see. The company came out of stealth mode in 2017. It's called BridgeBio Pharma. And it came out of stealth mode because we started the company with just a small amount of money. But by the time we got the attention of investors like KKR, we raised about 40 million. And then shortly thereafter, another 135 million. And shortly thereafter, another 300 million. And in 2019, BridgeBio was one of the largest biotech IPOs that year. And as of a few days ago, the company was valued at approximately $8.5 billion. 5 years, $8 billion. But this is not what the founders of BridgeBio Pharma are most proud of. What they're most proud of is the fact that in 5 years, they've put together a portfolio of 21 rare disease drugs, most of which were acquired preclinically, and 4 of them are in phase 3 clinical trials, and we expect the first approval later this year and another one next year if all goes well. So this is the power of combining the right kind of financing with the right biomedical expertise. So I'd like to turn now to what the economics really mean for the drug development industry and how it relates to vaccines, because that's a whole different story. So from my vantage point as a financial economist, the fundamental law of healthcare finance can be written down in just one equation, which is this one. The expected net present value of a particular biomedical asset is actually can be described with just 3 variables. It's equal to the present value of your profits. So if you get a drug approved, you're going to be able to sell the drug. What's the present value of that cash flow multiplied by the probability of success of that drug minus the cost of development? That's it. It's that simple. Well, I say that simple. Economists know a lot about costs. They know a lot about revenues and profits, and they even know how to calculate present values. But economists have nothing to say about this variable, the probability of success. And so that's what I've been focusing on with my students, Kinwei, Chihim, and others, on trying to understand this number right here. Because if you want to make good financial decisions about biomedical pipelines, you need to know all 3 of these variables. And as I said, we know a lot about 2 out of the 3, but at least as of a few years ago, I don't believe we knew enough about the 3rd. So a fair bit of research time in my group has been spent over the last few years estimating clinical trial success rates. I'll give you a little bit of a background on why we were so intent on doing this. If you look at the literature on what the probability of success is for a clinical trial to get a drug approved, historically, the answer that people have come up with is about 16%. This was published in 2010 by a group from Tufts University, which has had the longest track record of putting together these reports over the course of the last maybe 20 or 30 years. They've been studying this and calculating the probability of success. Well, that was in 2010. By 2016, the industry trade group Bio put out their report, and their estimate was not 16%, it was 9.6%. Now, you might think, for those of you who are not part of the biopharma industry, you might think, well, close enough, right? You're only off by about 6%. What's the big deal? Well, it turns out that is a really big deal, because remember, you've got to multiply this number by the present value of future profits of a drug. And if you think about the kind of drugs that are blockbusters these days and what that means for their present value of profits, you're typically multiplying this number by another number like 10 to 20 billion dollars. And when you multiply 10 to 20 billion dollars by a 6 percentage point difference, that's a lot of money. And so I didn't understand how you could disagree on this. So my approach was to try to estimate it myself. And in doing so, I started looking for data to be able to do that. And with Chihim and Kinwei, we've now published a series of papers on estimating probability of success. And I'll talk about these very briefly and then get to vaccines. But first, let me tell you about the data. So the data that Tufts, the Center for the Study of Drug Development, they used is this data set right here, which is data from about 50 of the biggest pharma companies. And the data set that we ultimately used, which is over to the left, is data that is based upon something like 5,700 different companies across 15,000 different drugs over a 15-year period. So it is 2 orders of magnitude larger than the data set that was used by Tufts. Now, I don't mean to criticize Tufts because, as I said, they were the pioneers in estimating these numbers. But remember, they were pioneers 20 or 30 years ago. And in those days, who developed drugs? It wasn't biotech or academic medicine. It was the big pharma companies. And so in the 1980s and 90s, if you were estimating probability of success, then this data was all you needed. But as of 2018, in the chart that I showed you at the very beginning, a lot more of the drugs are being developed today by biotechs and by academic medical centers. And so you really want to use the much larger data set that we're using. So we have a project at MIT called Project Alpha. Since I teach at a management school, every project that I work on has to have a fancy acronym like SMART. I think you guys win for the best acronym of all at the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology. But Project Alpha stands for Analytics for Life Sciences Professionals and Healthcare Advocates. And we've got a website, which all of you can visit, projectalpha.mit.edu. And on this website, we now provide estimates on a quarterly basis of all of the various different probabilities of successes for all the various different disease groups. You can see here various different disease categories and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 probabilities, probabilities of transitioning, probabilities of going all the way to the end. We've got rare disease probability estimates. We've got estimates with biomarkers, as well as for time series estimates. So from our perspective, now nobody should have to use these very crude numbers. You have much more accurate estimates based upon a much larger data set of these. Okay, so let me start focusing on vaccines now, and I'll wrap up in just a few minutes. It turns out that when you apply this analysis to vaccines, you get a very, very surprising result. So this is a table from the paper that Chahim, Kinwei, and I first published, where we looked at the probability of success for various different diseases. And I apologize, I realize that the slides are coming in a little bit fuzzy. Not quite sure why Zoom is doing that, but you'll have a copy of this afterwards. But I'll tell you the most important elements that I'm pointing to on the slide. It turns out that using data going back to between 2000 and 2015, historically, the probability of success for an area like oncology, cancer drugs, is 3.4%. Very, very low probability of success, very high failure rate. However, when you look at historically what the probability of success is for vaccines, you're getting 39%, which is literally 10 times higher than for cancer and higher than any other category. And if you take a look at more recent information, which is a paper that we published in the Harvard Data Science Review just last year, just a few months ago, what we find is that the more recent estimate, we have probabilities that are on the same order of magnitude, and yet when you look at the number of drugs being developed in the vaccine space, it's actually gone down over the course of the last few years. So here's a list of a bunch of probabilities of success for vaccines, and in some areas, you can see that the probability of success is actually greater than 70%. So you're talking about incredibly successful drug development programs. And yet somehow, despite all of this, companies are getting out of the business. Why? And the answer is actually pretty simple. It has to do with economic incentives. In a paper that we also published last year with some other students, what we show is that the business model for vaccines is challenging. The science and medicine are incredibly advanced. And the cost of developing a drug in the vaccine space is not that different from drugs in other areas. But the problem is that the revenues are not the same. Now, many nonprofit organizations like CEPI, the World Health Organization, CARB-X, the Gates Foundation, and so on, have done a lot to help out, but nonprofits are not enough. We need the private sector to be involved, and the problem is that the economics just aren't that attractive because, at least pre-pandemic, you could not charge a whole lot for the cost of developing a vaccine. you could not charge what it cost. And so in most cases, it would be a money-losing proposition. So here's an example. This is a list of a bunch of infectious diseases, the probability of an outbreak of those diseases, the average number of cases that epidemiologists have estimated in case of outbreak, and a demand multiplier that is a function of how bad the effects of the disease are. And when you do the math and you look at what typically governments are willing to pay for a dose of a vaccine, the bottom line is that the profitability is just really disappointing relative to what it costs. And so when we run a simulation of what happens if you include vaccines in an existing biotech or pharma company's portfolio, at least using historical numbers of what the cost would be of acquiring these and ultimately of payers paying for them, you're getting pretty much very unattractive returns, negative Sharpe ratios. And that's really the challenge. Now, the question is, what can be done? Well, there are actually many things that can be done. And one of the bright spots of COVID-19, one of the silver linings of this terrible, terrible disease is that now I believe governments will be much more flexible at engaging in these different kinds of business models. For example, advanced market commitments. If you tell a vaccine manufacturer, I'm willing to buy 100 million doses of your vaccine if and when you develop it, and I'm willing to pay $5 a shot, that would be tremendously valuable, and pharma companies would start coming back into the vaccine business. Or a Netflix model where you can say, I'm willing to pay you a fixed amount and you just produce as much vaccine as we need. A kind of a all-you-can-eat buffet, or what we call a Netflix model. And it turns out that we show when you use a Netflix-like subscription model, just with the G7 countries, you can actually raise on the order of $37 billion to create vaccines for all the infectious diseases that I showed you on that previous slide. And it is something that is definitely feasible if we have the right business model. Now, for COVID-19, there are many other things that we can do. In addition to pricing, we can think about more efficient clinical trial designs. We can think about various kinds of government policies. But the bottom line is that finance can actually play a positive role in helping us to deal with these difficult challenges. That we can actually use finance in a way that hasn't been used before to expedite the innovations occurring in this and many other fields. So let me wrap up by telling you that all of these ideas was made very personal to me in a few years ago when I learned about the story of one of my colleagues at MIT named Harvey Lodish. Harvey is a professor of biology at the famed MIT Whitehead Institute. And when I ran across Harvey's story, I decided right then and there that I want to be Harvey Lodish, and you will too when you hear the story. So Harvey in 1983 was approached by a biotech VC asking whether he would collaborate with him to develop a drug for a rare disease called Gaucher's syndrome. Gaucher's is a genetic disorder, a single gene mutation that prevents your body from producing a housekeeping enzyme that's actually quite important. And without it, fatty acids build up in your organs, in your bone marrow. And by the time you reach teenage years, you're usually dead. So Harvey decided that he would help out because he knew some of the important scientific ideas that would be able to allow them to develop this enzyme replacement therapy. And in 1991, the drug Ceridase was approved by the FDA, the first of its kind, a method to replace a patient's enzyme with something from out of the body. And so over the course of the years afterwards, they developed a number of versions of this drug, and it has saved the lives of tens of thousands of these Gaucher patients. And you may have heard of the company. The company's name is Genzyme, and it was acquired in the mid-2000s for something like $20 billion by Sanofi. But that's not why I want to be Harvey Lodish, although that's not a bad reason. I want to be Harvey because of what happened in 2002. You see, in that year, Harvey's daughter was pregnant with her child, her second child, Harvey and his wife's second grandchild, a boy that they named Andrew, a great name, by the way. Andrew was diagnosed with Gaucher's syndrome. And, you know, this was really quite a shock to Harvey and his family. I asked him about this. I talked about it. It was a very emotional conversation. I said, Harvey, in 1983, when you agreed to work on this, did you know that you had the mutation for Gaucher's disease? And he said, absolutely not. You know, that was way before the human genome was even sequenced, right? That was sequenced in 2003. It was 20 years before that. He said, I just thought that, you know, I could do some cool science and help some patients. So, you know, why not? Let's try it out. He had no idea that what he was working on would one day save the life of his as yet unborn grandson. But, you know, his grandson, Andrew, is doing just fine, pictured here, living a totally normal life, thanks to the drug that Grandpa helped to develop. This is why I want to be Harvey Lodish. But I can't, because I don't have a PhD in molecular biology. I can't do what Harvey does. But you know something? All of us, we can all be Harvey Lodish if we invest in the drugs that will save our as yet unborn grandchildren's lives someday. With the right kind of financing doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can actually do well by doing good. And sorry for the sound effects. I have to keep things interesting since my students are all on Zoom now. And anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Professor Lowe, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Let me ask a couple questions. I'll start off, and please, everyone who's attending, please use Q&A to bring us some questions as well. First question from a corporate perspective, pharmaceutical perspective. The second from a venture capital perspective. I was looking at the history of microRNA vaccine development, and in the laboratory it was known in the 1990s that this would be an effective approach. In about 2012, the encapsulation technology was developed so it could be effectively delivered. And around that time, DARPA provided funding to develop mRNA vaccine, primarily for SARS, which is a family of COVID. And then they funded Novartis, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Sanofi Pasteur. But by 2015, most of those companies had dropped out, even though the data that they were producing was really fantastic. And it was only CureVac and Moderna that actually stayed with it. And the larger companies said that they pulled out because the risk involved, the financial risk, and they were worried about the regulatory pathway for a new vaccine. Obviously, this has changed. This inflection point that you mentioned has changed with COVID. You know, the advanced market commitment that I guess the U.S. and several other people made changed the equation. But is this going to last? Do we look at this change occurring for a longer period of time, or is the financial market just going to collapse again?
Well, so that's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm really qualified to answer, because you really need to have some pharma industry insiders that would have a sense of exactly what some of the public policy issues are. But as an economist looking at this industry from the outside and trying to understand the dynamics, I have to tell you that not only do I think this is going to last, I think it's going to explode. I think it's going to grow tremendously, mainly because there are all sorts of infectious diseases that we right now do not have effective therapies, not just vaccines, but antibiotics. And we need them. People are going to die without these therapeutics. So now that we have the technology, we have to wonder, what can it not do? You know, what can mRNA technologies not deal with given that it's been able to deal with the SARS-CoV-2 virus in a matter of 63 days, and a little over a year later, we now have an approved vaccine. That's an extraordinary accomplishment. So I think that it's completely changed the economics of the situation. But at the same time, the other change, which has also been positive, is now governments around the world, including the United States, has finally gotten the message that we can't take a laid-back attitude towards these diseases. They can wreak enormous human death tolls in a very short period of time, never mind the economic damage that they've inflicted along the way. And so I think that on the one hand, the science has progressed. On the other hand, the public policy has now gotten to the point where we realize we need to work together with the science in order to make all of this possible. So I believe that what we're seeing today is going to be the beginning of a golden age of how to deal with infectious diseases. And I'm hopeful that we don't lose momentum. There is a possibility that 3 years later, after we've forgotten about this, we may decide to focus on other things. But I suspect that this pandemic will leave a permanent mark on all of our psychologies.
The economic model shift for advanced market commitment, or the Netflix market that you mentioned, is that really the venue of large governments or multi-government groups, or is it something that insurance companies would see an incentive in getting involved in?
Oh, absolutely, insurance companies as well as governments. I'll give you an example. In the United States, a few years ago, a drug company called Gilead developed a cure for hepatitis C. Basically, 12 weeks of a pill, Sovaldi, will eliminate hepatitis C permanently in your body. Really amazing therapeutic, but at $84,000 list price, which is what it was introduced at, and with 3 million patients in the United States that have hepatitis C, that would have been a tremendous hit if everybody were to get vaccinated or treated all at the same time. And it turns out that a lot of payers were not able to cover that. And so the state of Louisiana, in collaboration with one of my academic colleagues, Rena Conti, came up with this Netflix model specifically for hepatitis C, and working in collaboration with Gilead. That's an example of a state, one state, that decided that they were going to change the way that they paid for this with Medicaid using this kind of a Netflix model. So absolutely, I think payers are not only very interested in this, a number of them are actually getting to the point where they're actively working with drug manufacturers to come up with innovative reimbursement models.
Wow. Fascinating. It really opens up a whole new world, doesn't it? My second question is more about the venture capital community, and in particular for what we're doing at SMART. We are spending a lot of time looking at drug-resistant bacteria and trying to come up with therapies for that. And as you know, they're predicting by 2050, more people will die from bacteria infections that can't be treated than from cancer. And yet, you know, having spent time going to the venture community, when you talk about infectious disease or antibiotic development, they just don't want to hear it. I mean, they want to focus on cancer and those sort of therapies. And the economic model you mentioned really explains that. But I've noticed that in the last 9 months or so, there have actually been VCs that are set up that are just focusing now on infectious disease. So do you think these new economic models that you've talked about, the inflection point that you mentioned, will also filter into AMR kind of technologies as well?
You know, I think it could, but the reason that I can't be sure is that depends a lot on public policy. Mm-hmm. And the reason is simple. When you're dealing with cancer, the private sector, I think, has done a very good job of covering that space because they work collectively with the payers and are able to come up with reimbursement policies that make that particular part of the industry quite sustainable and quite successful. When you're dealing with infectious diseases, by definition, this is a public health issue. And so, in other words, if you get cancer, I would feel very bad for you. So God forbid, I hope you don't. But the fact is that you're getting cancer doesn't really affect me really personally unless you and I are part of the same circle of friends or family. But if you get COVID and I'm sitting next to you on the subway, it absolutely affects me. And so infectious diseases have a public health element that is not true for many other diseases. And as a result, government has to be involved. And that's one of the reasons why a number of the governments in Asia, which traditionally tends to be more centralized in their control of various aspects of the population, have been more successful in dealing with than in the United States. In order to be able to deal with the public health issues, we have to get government involved in a much more direct way. And clearly in the US, we are behind, but we're hoping to make up for lost time over the course of the next few weeks and months.
Very, very, very interesting. I mean, it's really eye-opening, and see how we can really look ahead rather than waiting for a COVID-like event to happen and then respond. If particularly in the drug-resistant bacteria area, if we could start thinking about it ahead of time and come up with government policy changes, and your work really shows that with those kind of policy changes and new business models, we can actually start solving those problems which are going to plague us in the future. I see some questions here talking about clinical studies as well, and you know, this inflection point that you mentioned. Obviously, there was a technology breakthrough. There was messenger RNA. How quickly you can develop a vaccine from that. The new economic model that you mentioned. And also, I guess the need for clinical trial changes as well. I read a paper that you did recently looking at COVID and looking at different potential clinical trial studies from, you know, the traditional approach where you have, you know, two groups and you just expose them to the environment, a human controlled trials or challenge trials, and then what you've advocated, which was adaptive randomized clinical trials. Maybe you can comment a little bit about that, and where you see, you know, based on the research that you've done, the clinical trials moving so we can have more efficiency in that area as well.
Well, again, I'm an outsider to the industry, but the way that I got involved in studying clinical trial design is really through the statistical angle. It turns out that some of the statistics that I've used in my financial analysis actually applies to clinical trials, namely Bayesian decision analysis. And so as part of that research, I came to realize that there are a number of ways that we can actually make the clinical trial process more efficient. And these are ideas that I didn't come up with, but others in the industry, like the colleagues of mine, that we published a joint paper that described these various different techniques of adaptive platform trials using Bayesian decision analysis. So the basic idea is that instead of waiting for a clinical trial to be done, looking at the very beginning and waiting until the end, you collect the data along the way and you use that information in an adaptive sense to change the design of the trial so that if you start getting really, really positive results, you maybe stop the trial sooner because you're demonstrating efficacy. And if you end up not getting very good results, maybe negative results, you stop the trial early for ethical reasons. By using the data in an adaptive way, you can get a conclusion much quicker and without nearly as much financial burden to the investors. And so this notion of an adaptive platform trial actually has financial implications, which is why I'm interested in it. So there's a lot that can be done in order to make these trials much, much more efficient. And in the paper that I'm happy to send people who are interested, email me. I can you know, give you an example of how that works.
A very interesting question is asked about how do lower income countries handle this. Clearly, a country like America can, you know, do advanced market commitments. I know the Genzyme case that I think you mentioned with orphan drugs. A big issue there was really developing the business model. How do you collect from a small number of patients? How do you set up your supply line? How do you do it in a way that is is reasonable for even people that can't afford it. How do you package it within the insurance environment, which Genzyme figured out very well. So in the vaccine area, where these new business models are going to be important, how does the smaller, lower income country participate and not get left out?
Yeah, that's a really important question that actually has a huge number of different non-economic dimensions to it: political dimension, an ethical dimension, and so on. So the first point I want to make is that the total revenues of anything, of any economic commodity, is equal to the price per commodity multiplied by the number of people that are going to purchase that. And we often forget that when we look at the price. It's price multiplied by the quantity of sales. And, for the lesser developed countries, for the countries that aren't as well off, they still have a lot of people. And these people, they may not be able to pay the same price, but if it's a large enough population, then from a purely financial point of view, it will make it worthwhile for drug developers to be able to provide those countries with the appropriate drugs. So that's the first point. And by the way, for most economic commodities, not just drugs, but for most commodities, the vast majority of the profits are not being generated by the super wealthy. You know who's providing most of the profits for companies like Amazon and eBay and other organizations? It's the middle class. And in many cases, it's the lower middle class, which is much, much larger. And again, per person, the price may not be high, but when you multiply it by a much larger number of people, it is still profitable. So that's the first point. However, even if you take that into account, there are still circumstances where there are countries that can't afford the kind of drugs that they need. And I think in that case, we collectively as a society, as a global society, have a political and an ethical issue to deal with. That ethical issue was dealt with in COVID-19 with an organization called COVAX. COVAX was a consortium of something like, 149 countries that came together in the midst of the pandemic to say, you know what, we have to figure out not only how to develop a vaccine, but once we get it, how do we distribute it in a fair and equitable manner, which is a really extraordinary thing when you come to think about it, because there are very wealthy countries in that group that did not have to participate, but they did so. There were 2 countries that did not join COVAX as of a few weeks ago. Those 2 countries were Russia and the United States. And I'm proud to say that one of the first things that President Biden did when he took office was he joined COVAX. So we are now part of COVAX. And so that's an example where it's not just about economics. As an economist, it's very difficult for me to admit that there's life outside of economics, but it turns out that when you're dealing with life and death issues, it just can't possibly just be about the economics. That would be absolutely obscene.
Right.
And so that's really what needs to happen. We need to come together and think about it from an ethical and political dimension.
Right. There's an equivalent question that just came out. Most local diseases, particularly in the tropics, are isolated to those areas. Unlike COVID, which was a global disease, so we got a global impact. How do you think that tropical kind of infectious diseases, what kind of business model or government policy would work for those?
Well, I think that we have to think again as a global community. And you might think that certain diseases don't matter, and that's actually part of the analysis that I did, which gave me a very discouraging conclusion, which is that if you look at the regional aspects of these infectious diseases, it seems very difficult to make the financial case that you should be investing in all of them until you realize that there's this thing that we invented called the airplane. And people that have these infectious diseases get on these airplanes, and then they travel to London, to Athens, to New York. And before you know it, we have, Zika in Florida and Ebola in Texas. So I don't think that we can think about the world as the kind of divided segmented, isolated
Right.
micro regions that we have in the past with infectious diseases. It's just too easy for people to transport them around the world. So I think we have to really think carefully. And that's another aspect of the change in mindset that this pandemic has brought to all the governments around the world. I'm hopeful that we're going to be more rational in dealing with those aspects.
Let me ask one last question because our time is running out. But everyone is concerned about the next pandemic. You know, they're talking about disease X now, and you know, particularly with the rise of potentially more zoonotic viruses jumping from animals to humans. Based on the lessons that we learned from COVID, based on the economic models that you've been able to envision, how can we as a society prepare for disease X, which is inevitable? How can we prepare for it?
Well, there's a lot that can be done, first of all, and I think the various different organizations that I mentioned earlier are in fact doing it. One example is an organization called CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. So this is an organization that's also a multi-country consortium that came together years ago to deal with infectious diseases in a more systematic way. And so CEPI has put together a hit list of something like 16 of the most deadly infectious diseases that we need to pay attention to. Well, one thing we can do is to start developing vaccines for all of those diseases and stockpile them so that we have them at the ready to stamp out any kind of epidemic or pandemic, God forbid, that should emerge. And we can finance that through various different government contributions, government bonds, public-private partnerships. There are many different ideas. But we can do many other things. We can, for example, set up clinical trial networks right now to deal with the next pandemic so that when it hits, we can actually put into action all sorts of different clinical trials around the world to be able to deal with it at a moment's notice. Now that we understand the importance of PPE, we can start thinking about how to get the supply chain set up so that when there is a shortage, we can deal with that effectively. We can talk about pricing models so that when you're in the midst of a pandemic, you can allow certain manufacturers to charge twice, 3 times the normal price without fear of getting retribution for price gouging. Because if we agree now that surge pricing, which is what Uber does, which is what FedEx does, which is what various other organizations do in order to take into account the differences of supply and demand, we can actually have a conversation now about how to deal with that. But I think the key thing is for all of us to start thinking about the world as a single community and to be able to come together and deal with this issue, because we can't go it alone. If we do, we're going to end up repeating the experience that the United States has had with just the unconscionable number of deaths that have occurred in this country over the last 12 months.
Well, Professor Lowe, I think we're going to have to end at this point. Our time has run out. I thank you very much for your presentation. I hope that the government leaders and pharmaceutical company executives and VCs who are listening to this event will take mind to what you've said, and I think you know, coming up with the right economic models for this is as important as coming up with good science. So thank you very much for spending your evening with us. Very insightful, and I guess we can all virtually applaud him. I don't know how we do that, but thank you very much, sir. And
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I want to also say a word of thanks to the government of Singapore, SGInnovate, and of course the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology. It's really a pleasure and a privilege and an honor for me to be part of it, and hope at some point I'll be able to visit the wonderful country in person.
We hope so, and thank you again. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Today's session is recorded, and the organizers will be sending the video link to you within a few days, and hopefully, you know, the slides will show up better on those video links. If not, please contact us. Next in our series will be in May, so stay tuned for more deep talk with MIT thought leaders. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.